It's one of the most extraordinary moments in Britain's history. Prime Minister Boris Johnson refusing calls from his own cabinet to resign. Nine's Brett McLeod is outside the Prime Minister's residence. Brett, the Queen could be dragged into this mess.
Yeah, this is the site of one of the highest wind speeds ever recorded by man.
Arson could be the cause of a fire at the Sydney home of controversial comedian, commentator and YouTuber Friendly Geordies.
Supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies.
And to get hot, I got hairy legs that turn turn blonde in the sun.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Fence Sitters podcast, our China special. Today we're going to be running through our evolved thoughts on China and the US and atrocities and greatness and all that comes with it. Will, how are you doing today?
I am very good, Tiago. So yes, this is our China special. We touched on China a little bit a few episodes back, and we had some kind of differing views, and I feel like we hadn't done enough research. So we went away. We took a week off last week. So, you know, I'm sure that impacted all of you massively. We've done our research, and now we really want to just discuss and get to the bottom of what we think is probably the largest and most influential geopolitical problem of our time, of our current times, and for the next century, I would argue.
I will say this. Yeah. This isn't necessarily a debate, so to speak. It's more like I've got some thoughts, Will's got some thoughts. Let's sort of help each other work out what we actually think. Because there's a lot of information, and I'm struggling to work out what's relevant and what's not. So I hope you can help me out with that.
So, to start with, I guess I'll kind of, for people who might not know, not the intricate details, but the overarching theme and problem is that the USA has more or less been financially, economically, militaristically, politically dominant of more or less the whole world. I mean, really, since the beginning of the Cold War, they were kind of battling it out with the Soviet Union. And then since the demise of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the US has been pretty much completely dominant with their Western liberal ideals over the whole world. And it's only now, in the last 5 to 10 years, that China, the People's Republic of China, which is different to Taiwan, which we'll get onto later, China has experienced absolutely phenomenal levels of economic growth not seen pretty much ever in modern times at all.
Yeah.
So to give you an example, in 2010, the IMF predicted that China's annual GDP growth would be 10.6%, which is just phenomenal. The US hasn't gone above 5% GDP growth since I think the 1970s, and when they did, they only reached 7. So the rise of China, in an economic sense, in a militaristic sense, in a political sense around the world, is massive, and it's been accelerating. And so then it poses the question, which sparks a lot of debate, is, well, how does the world react to this? How does the US react to this? Because you've obviously got two powers, one dominant, one rising up. Something has to happen. There has to be some conflicting point. So when is that point, and what's going to happen? And I don't know, would you kind of like to present the two arguments, perhaps, Tiago?
Yeah, well,
of what might happen?
I'd even say there's probably 3. So
3, okay.
In one sense, you'd have the US remains dominant on top, either by growing themselves at a faster rate than China or dominating over China, suppressing them. Or you have China becoming dominant in the same way, either growth by themselves or invasion of certain places, or suppressing what the US has access to. And then the third option, which it seems impossible, but it could happen, is that you have the US and you have China with more or less equal power working together.
Yeah. I think Kevin Rudd was calling that like what, managed strategic competition, something along those lines. Yeah. And for those listeners who don't know, Kevin Rudd was a recent Labour Prime Minister of Australia. He was Foreign Minister of Australia. He's now the ambassador to America, Australia's ambassador to America. And he also has a PhD specifically on Xi Jinping.
Yes.
So he is a very, and completely fluent in Mandarin. He's a very knowledgeable man on the topic.
I'm sure he'll come up again in our discussion because he's such an influential person in this debate.
Yeah, so to go on with what you've just said, Tiago, so there's kind of three main things there. And obviously many factors around that. The thing with the first one, which is, the idea that America stays dominant, China stays subdominant, and the American economy outpaces the Chinese one, I think inevitably that can't happen. Simply because, at least in regards to GDP, the Chinese population is 4 times larger than the American population. So simply by economic fact, once a quarter of the Chinese population reaches the same living standards as the American population, their GDP will surpass America. So economic dominance, specifically in relation to GDP, China will dominate. And the date of when that crossover will happen is obviously up for debate, and it's being pushed back a little bit further because of the kind of economic headwinds that China's been experiencing as of recent. But economists are putting it like it'll certainly happen by 2045, 2050, but it could also quite likely happen like late 2030s. Which, looking that far forward, which isn't really that far forward. I mean, it's less than 25 years. Well, not less than 25 years, but it's almost 25 years to 2050, to the middle of the century. And so I think the rise, at least the economic rise of China and surpassing America, at least in the qualification of GDP, is inevitable. And the US will kind of decelerate as China's accelerating. So I think I don't know. I think there's no real chance of America staying economically dominant over China.
Yeah, well, you say that, but they could stay economically dominant if they use slightly dirtier tactics than we might be assuming in this conversation, because you're talking about it would be impossible for them just to grow and surpass China, right? But just economic growth in your own right isn't the only way to stay dominant over someone. So the other thing they can do is they can restrict trade from different countries and do things like that to make sure that they're always underneath. But then comes the question of how moral that is, because then
So that, I mean, that's kind of the first scenario. The second scenario you pointed out of China becoming dominant over the US. I personally think that's quite dangerous, because, I mean, the fundamental thing, which my mind always comes back to, is more or less, how do we avoid the Third World War? Like, how does that happen? What can we do, and what has to happen to make sure that we avoid the Third World War? And I think we should probably explain to listeners that there's a specific crisis tension point in between the US and China, and that's the island of Taiwan. Taiwan is made up of many islands. It even has a few islands which are as little as like 10 kilometers off the Chinese coast, which I didn't actually realize, but it's really close. But the actual large main island of Taipei, sorry, not Taipei, that's the capital, Formosa is the main island, is 70 miles off the coast of China, so there's a large amount of ocean there. But the thing is, so there's history behind this. In After the Second World War, after the Japanese had been kicked out of China, China fell back into civil war. So there was more, it was quite complicated, but more or less there was communist Chinese, and then there was more kind of right-leaning nationalists with fascist connections, nationalist Chinese. And the communist Chinese, kind of with the support of the Russians, more or less won the civil war against the nationalists, and the nationalists evacuated to the island of Taiwan. So most people in the modern day, at least people our age, think Taiwan is its own separate country. Well, hold on. They think it's its own separate country, but they think it's always been its own separate country, and that it's always had its own kind of national identity. But the reality is, it links back to the original China, and it also claims to be the original China.
Yes.
And so communist China, and then you've got Taiwan, and so for communist China to kind of finally finish their revolution and their solidification as a nation state, it's become fundamental to Xi Jinping's ideology that they successfully reunite China and invade and conquer Taiwan.
Yeah.
Which poses a lot of difficulties on the world stage.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you've touched on the idealistic reason for an invasion of Taiwan by China, but there is also great economic positives that China would have from an invasion of Taiwan. Which do you mind if we go into semiconductors now?
Yes, go into semiconductors. So
Okay,
explain that side of things.
If you don't know what a semiconductor is, and why the hell would you? According to the India Times, semiconductor chips are materials which have conductivity between conductors and insulators. Semiconductor materials include pure elements and compounds like silicon, germanium, gallium, and my notes are really far. Arsenide or calcium, cellerite. If none of that makes sense, think of anything that has the word smart in it. Smart fridge, smart car, smart phone, smart tablets, anything that's got a computer in it essentially has one of these semiconductor chips. And obviously everything nowadays has a computer. Like you have your infotainment system on your car, it has one in it. You have like your washing machine has one in it. Anything that needs to think for itself in any way has one of these chips. And the statistics are that according to The Economist, I got my sources written down for once, 15% of Taiwan's GDP is the production of semiconductor chips. They also produce 60% of the world's semiconductor chips and 90% of the most advanced one. So Taiwan is like making a killing off these chips, right? And they're shipping them out all over the world, including to America, Australia, the UK, everywhere, for development of their technology. But not China. And the reason they do not do it to China is because they've actually been banned. And I'm not 100% sure how this works, but foreign companies are not allowed to sell semiconductor chips to China. So they have to manufacture them themselves, which is like awfully expensive when you have to set up resources to do this. The other thing that's interesting is the resources and machinery and equipment needed to set up manufacturing for these semiconductor chips have also been banned to be sold to China by America. So you could see why you've already got this like massive history and build up of why China would want to enter into Taiwan, and then you add on to that this resource, and people have made like a comparison to oil here, but instead of being a natural resource, it's obviously a man-made one, but they've got this resource that China really struggles to have access to right on their doorstep. And then the US goes like, no, you can't sell it to them either. So it's like this weird sort of, I don't know, like incentive that wouldn't be there as much if it wasn't for this these trade tariffs. And I just thought that was an interesting point to bring up. But yeah,
I don't know. I'm personally not as convinced on the oil point. I think, currently a lot of China's oil they get from Russia, and they also have very good links with Iran, who supplies oil as well. So I don't know.
I
don't
didn't mean
think
it like literally. I meant that like it's a resource that may start a war between two superpowers.
Right.
Well, not two. Well, between two countries. Yeah, that's the
the
comparison that's being
the
made with oil and semiconductor chips. But yeah, it seems like a very, very strange, but also lines up with what I was sort of saying before about the way the US could dominate China is by suppressing what they have access to.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you think, okay, if US is really, really upset about Taiwan being invaded because they're this like hub for democracy and shows it's like this idealistic place and it's like grown and flourished and all that.
It's the democratic opposite of what China could be.
Yeah. Why would they put a policy in place like this that puts them in far more danger? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I would say there is. Well, this gets down to the central like moral question, which Tiago and I have like briefly discussed before, which is America attempting to contain China because of idealistic moral reasons of democracy and liberty and freedom, or are they simply attempting to contain China to politically dominate the world? And because they don't want to be usurped by China. And so you could say, well, with the thing with Taiwan, so America making it impossible for Taiwan to export semiconductor chips to China. I mean, you could say, the two ideas of the idealistic and the rational are linked, because you can say, well, America wants to dominate the world because they think that liberal democratic values should be upheld everywhere. Therefore, they can dominate by forcing Taiwan to not export semiconductor chips to China. But I mean, you're far more cynical of this view, I assume.
Yeah.
So I mean, what do you think, Tiago? Do you think America is simply like they don't really care about democracy at all and liberty, and they don't really give two hoots about the several millions of free citizens living in Taiwan, or do you think they actually do kind of care about that kind of those ideals?
I don't like. I was pretty convinced of what you're saying, like what I was saying last week or the week before, 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, that it is more about the
political
dominance. But I mean, we were discussing this like just the other day. The more you look into this, the more the question really becomes quite muddled. I think it's a mixture of both, but I think a lot of people, and obviously when America's talking about why they want to dominate China, they're not going to be like, oh, we're going to have so much money and power. They're going to, like, no one would support that. But they're going to bring up, oh, look at these human rights violations that have happened in China. Look at this flourishing economy and this nation of Taiwan. And look what would happen if they invaded it. They're not going to be like, oh, so there's these semiconductor chips, right? And they're really important. And we'd really like to have all the access to them. So, I think that, well, yes, it could be a mixture of both. I think that there is a lot of, what's the word? Distruths, mistruths. Like, not telling the full story of why they want to go.
But then, I mean, it's like, well, it's like, okay, so sure, America has strategic ambitions which are in its own favor, but it's like, I mean, the fundamental question which it comes down to for me is, who would I rather dominate the world? And personally, I would rather America dominate the world. That's my fundamental view. Yeah. I mean, the list of sure, America. I mean, I don't even think it is the worst of two evils. I think one is genuinely better than the other. And you could say, okay, well, you're just brainwashed, liberal, believer in democracy, so of course you'd support that. And it's like, well, I mean, at least, sure, America gets up to dodgy stuff, but they don't get up to as much dodgy stuff as China. And so, in the case of competition, I would rather America come out on top, but I think inevitably China will come out on top. And then it's sad to think, but it's like, well, in that contrasting competition, how do we manage that competition so that there's no actual war? Because, like, my kind of final conclusion is, how do we, because it's okay. So if you believe America should be on top over China, then you would kind of conclude that in a conflict between them, you'd like America to kind of go in and, I suppose, introduce democracy into China and kind of deconstruct the communist state and everything. But I think that would be far worse and far catastrophic and far more death than just slowly letting China kind of reduce in its communist tendencies. But I don't really know if that's going to happen. So I don't know.
The thing you say, I was actually I read a chapter in Obama's book in preparation for
Obama's book.
Yes.
Okay.
He went. I can't remember which Chinese leader it was at the time, but anyway, he went into China and had a meeting with him, and he said basically, he was like, the way you're going about creating your economy is democracy would work so much better. Why don't you do this? And then he what we said at the beginning of the episode, he pointed out, well, look how many people we've lifted out of poverty doing this. And so it's like, and I don't think you were actually saying this, but if we were like, if America was to be dominant, I don't think it's then wise for them to be like, all right, since we have all the power, you need to be a democracy, because what happens to all the progress that's been made, even if it's in a way that we don't necessarily agree with?
Yeah. I guess so. I mean, but it's like, sure, they've lifted all those people out of poverty, but you can lift people out of poverty, even in a communist state, without what I would argue systemically repressing ethnic minorities, or without bringing upon civil liberty restrictions into the people of Hong Kong, or things like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do see what you mean. But that doesn't mean that the whole system needs to be reformed. Like, there's bad parts of it. Do you know what I'm saying? So
yeah,
we're getting very abstract already.
Yeah.
Like, if America was dominant in this ideal world, they wouldn't go in and like change the whole system, but perhaps they'd have more influence to say, hey, settle down on these particular bad things. And I think that would be, which is why I sort of come to the conclusion that they kind of need to work together. That way America can keep China in check, and China can also sort of keep America in check. How we get there, I guess we'll work out.
Yeah. Okay. So going back 3 weeks ago with the kind of stuff you were saying, I'm kind of curious. So, would you rather the US to be dominant in the world rather than China?
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
I
stand by what I said about like US doing really terrible things, but looking at it like pure numbers, which is kind of horrible to do with human life, but we kind of have to. Okay. The US hasn't caused as much death and destruction, but they have caused more conflict, which is interesting. But then, we could just go on like back and forth for ages. I don't know.
Yes.
If you
I mean, that's
just...
kind of the point of this. Yeah.
But if you look at pure numbers, which I've tried to do, because what else do you do? It seems as though in the last 50 years, China has caused more destruction than America. But that's not to say that America hasn't caused any destruction. I don't know, man. Which is why I'm
and
like, if you had them both in power, you'd have someone for America to be like, if you didn't just have one superpower, then no one's accountable for their actions. So if you have multiple big superpowers at the same sort of level, then you have someone that can actually keep you accountable.
But I mean, but it won't. I mean, it wouldn't really be. I don't know. I mean, two superpowers keeping each other accountable. If the US is like, yo, you are, China, you're, ethnically repressing millions of Uyghurs, please stop. And then China's like, oh, no, we're not. We're just re-educating them. It's fine. There's nothing there. We haven't had any terrorist attacks since 2016. And then it's like, okay, well, we've held you to account. I mean, and then it's no, like, I don't.
But if they're on, they can do things after just asking them to do stuff, Which, actually, no. Why aren't they doing that now then? Well, I guess they are.
But it's not having an impact.
It's not having an
I mean,
impact.
that's what I'm saying. Yeah. You can't really, within the borders of a country, you can't really, influence in that regard, into the regard which is needed.
Because I suppose just by sheer the way that time is, America's sort of declining and China's coming up, and we're sort of at a crossroad where they kind of are equally dominant. And
they are equal powers.
My theory is not sort of playing out.
Yeah. That's the problem I see.
Yeah.
Going back, because I remember 3 weeks ago as well, so if the US and China went to war over Taiwan and Australia went to war as well, would you support Australia declaring war on China?
Okay, so this is what I've sort of looked into as well.
Yeah.
I would say when China steps into Taiwan, that's when we can engage. I don't like the idea but I don't like the idea that's presented now of we should engage before they get there.
Is that the idea? I think I'd say isn't the idea now not we should build up and be ready for and then engage once they go into Taiwan?
In Australia, yes, I guess that's kind of what we're talking about. But in America, from what I've seen with interviews with senators and congressmen and stuff like that, a lot of them are saying go in now before they...
What, a preemptive strike?
It's what they're calling it is what is it? Proactive defense. So you defend somewhere before because it seems like that place, which I would suggest is probably offense, but
have you got any specifics in regards to what they were actually promoting? I'm pretty curious now.
Oh my gosh, I love how we go and do research and then I decide to pull out the one thing
from 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. I'll try and put a link in the description for this. But the reason isn't like all the people that are saying that sort of stuff. Their reason isn't democracy or anything. It is the semiconductor chips, which is kind of confusing to me, because I would have.
Okay.
Because I would have thought that like
it would be democracy.
Yeah, especially if they're talking about it already. I don't know. Yeah, I went in after a few weeks ago. I went in, I was like, all right, okay, I see what Will's saying. Let's look this up. And then it's just like semiconductors, and I'm like, what?
Yeah. No, that is odd. That is odd. Yeah. I don't know. What about? I mean, the other side of things is like the research I've done for this. I don't know. I have this really kind of mixed view of the Chinese state in general now. Because so there's 1.4 billion people living there. They've gone through a massive economic upturn. They've pulled millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, I'm pretty sure, out of poverty. And you look at videos and interviews of like the average Han Chinese person. Han, if you don't know, is the dominant, it's actually the dominant ethnicity of the world, because there is so many Han Chinese, which are the Eastern Chinese people group. And they, they're kind of separate from the more Western Muslim-based ethnic Chinese people groups. But you look at like the average Han Chinese kind of family which lives in Shanghai and whatever, and from interviews and videos and stuff, they they get on with their life, they work hard, they have access to half decent consumer goods, they have decent rail links, bus links, and they just they're allowed to travel outside of China if they wish for holidays. They can come back in. There's those kind of freedoms there. So I'd never really thought about the average Chinese person living a day in China and what that would look like in regard to that side of things. And I was like, oh, okay, that actually doesn't seem that bad, I guess. And then I was like, well, I mean, and then I looked at the other side of things and I was like, well, hold on a second. They are a one-party state with a leader, Xi Jinping, who's now the most authoritarian leader really since Mao Zedong. You've got no free elections at all, really. You have, by nature of it being a one-party state, there's no opposition to counter the dominant party. The judicial system is completely politically corrupt, because there are politically biased committees kind of, influencing every single judicial system choice, and judicial choice. And, there's only one trade union, which is the ACFTU, and it has to verify and allow every single strike that any Chinese worker wants to do. And of course, why would you, go forward to the government and say, yo, can we please strike? And the government's like, well, no, you can't. Of course you can't. It's just, there's no free print media. There's limited religious freedoms. I don't know. And then you go and you look at what's happening in Hong Kong, and you look at what's happening in Tibet, and also in Xinjiang province, and there's just it's horribly atrocious kind of things going on. And another thing, which we can get onto later, but another thing which I want to get to about authoritarianism and dictatorship is, and I want to come at this from an artistic point of view, as a creative. It's very at least I find it, and from what I've read, I find it very kind of stifling to the human spirit of creativity. The fact that there is no political freedom or media freedom. The fact that kids are being taught Xi Jinping thought, which is literally indoctrinating political philosophy based around the leader Xi Jinping, being taught to primary school children. I mean, I'm a big believer in free thought and creating and wondering and pondering, and I mean, just the political machine and bureaucracy of China is completely brainwashing. I mean, I would argue everyone, and just it's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. And to be honest, if the war between the US and China, if there was a way to bring China to democracy and to fulfill democracy within China and to release those people and allow them to be free without killing heaps and heaps of people and bringing the economy of the whole world to a crash, I would do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. No.
And I think, yeah. I mean, what do you want to say?
No. I don't disagree with you at all. In terms of, it's funny. It's funny because you look at it with no context, right? And you're like, oh,
yeah.
As we're saying, they've built up these extremely amazingly efficient systems, and they've done all this but then you're right. It's like stifling what it means to be a human.
Human, yeah.
So, yeah, and if we're talking strictly US versus China, which we're not necessarily, we're kind of just talking about China, but it's hard to talk about it without talking about the US. And you look at a place like the US with so much creativity and while not perfect, and while there still isn't the perfect freedom that we might look for in an idealistic society, there is still so much more of that. I think having those the ability to speak out and having the ability to create whatever art you want, no matter who it's critical of, in my opinion, and I'm sure in your opinion, and this might just be because we sort of identify with these fields more than anything else, is a far, far more important thing than just economic growth. You know?
Yeah. I don't know. It's an interesting one. Like I don't know. From my research, it seems that the Chinese state is a fundamentally bad, if not, quite frankly, bordering on evil, political machine. And what they're doing to the 1.4 billion Chinese people, I think, is horrendous. And people who excuse that and try to cover up really what's happening, I think they should be ashamed of themselves. I don't know.
I had something in my head, now it's gone.
It's gone. Okay. Boy.
But the thing is, okay, how do you then go about dealing with this without millions and millions of deaths and people being brought more further into poverty? And or is it we have to take that hit in order for a better world in the future?
Well, I don't know. It's an interesting one because I was thinking about this as well, right? People go like, if you look at Taiwan in relation to its economic growth and its freedom and its liberties, you look at it, I honestly think China could be like Taiwan. If there was democracy, if there had been that kind of that democratic base within China which rose up, that would be fundamentally completely change China for the better, I would imagine. Like the point I want to make is it's different. Like America going in and trying to put democracy into Iraq, trying to put democracy into Afghanistan, I would argue that would be fundamentally different to America trying to encourage democracy within China, because the Iraqis and the Afghans, they have deep religious, political, philosophical, cultural traditions which simply don't really function in democratic context. But you look at South Korea, you look at Japan, you look at Taiwan, you even look at Hong Kong, which is literally not on the Chinese mainland, but it was connected, more or less with mainland China, and then Macau, which was like the Portuguese equivalent of Hong Kong, connected with mainland China. It's examples of, East Asian countries which function well, which flourish, and which can have a brilliant system under a representative liberal democracy. And just imagine if 1.4 billion people were brought, I kind of sound like some radical preaching democracy guy, but imagine if 1.4 billion Chinese people were brought into a fully functioning liberal democratic state with a peaceful transition from that communist authoritarian state into that liberal state. The result in the world, like the economic partnerships, the impact on climate change, the treaties which could be drawn up, the containment of Russia, which then could be brought forwards. Like, it's just unthinkable how almost brilliant it would be. And I'm almost cringing at myself as I say all this, but I can't find an argument against it.
I guess the argument against it would be, how do you peacefully do that?
Well, this is the thing. I don't think you really can.
Yeah.
Which is so sad.
Which is so then we have to then look at what realistically can happen.
Yeah.
And while the idea of this flourishing democracy of 1.4 billion people is just glorious, really, it can't happen without bloodshed. And then you...
Well, I don't know. I think, because I was thinking about the USSR, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, very beginning, no, not very beginning. Okay, Stalinist Russia has a lot, I would say it has some fundamental similarities with communist China now. A single authoritarian figurehead who's indoctrinating everyone with a cult of personality, and also a highly centralized bureaucracy and ethnic repression against minorities as well. But the thing with Russia is Russia slowly over the centuries kind of went through economic downturn and collapse, and politically became more and more liberal until what's his name? This is embarrassing. The final Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, until Gorbachev came in, kind of went a bit too far with the liberalism, and everything just went crazy.
Yeah.
But the thing with China, right, Tiago, and this is crazy, is that, like, China, they ditched, because the reason Russia collapsed was economic, primarily, mostly. China realized that, they ditched the full-on socialist, crazy government-controlled economics, and brought in more capitalist tendencies. So it's like they've got the growth, the prosperity, the stability of a capitalist economy, combined with the restrictions, the restriction of civil liberties, the control and the ideology of a communist political system, and they've put those two together. Russia collapsed and was able to transform into a brief period for what I think could have been a good point for the West to accept Russia in and bring in democracy into Russia, which they failed, which is sad and relates to what I think is happening in Ukraine. But that's a whole nother episode. But that collapse and collapse of Russia into a democracy, I don't think can ever really happen in China either, because they have that capitalist undercurrent which keeps their economy going. So it's like what I don't know. We're not really coming to any conclusions or things here. It's yeah.
I guess what I also fear, if a war was to break out, is a war of this scale is very different from a war of this scale 100 years ago.
Yeah.
It sounds alarmist and crazy, but I don't think it really is to suggest that a full-blown war, World War III, does anyone survive that at all?
Well, I think, I don't know. You've got to make the distinction between a war of conventional weapons and then a war of nuclear weapons. And the war of nuclear weapons is where a literal kind of apocalyptic end of humanity would be possible. I personally think the US and China, if let's say, hypothetically, and the fact that we're talking about this and like Kevin Rudd is talking about this, I think people should be more concerned. But like hypothetically, Xi Jinping has said again and again, reunification of China is the fundamental goal of the Chinese People's Republic. Come 2049, which is 100 years from the split, if we're militaristically ready and America's kept on their downward spiral and we've kind of kept going upwards, and if we're ready, we'll do it. And so let's say, I don't know, 2040, 2045, they go into Taiwan. The impact would just be fundamentally catastrophic, even on a conventional weapon scale.
Yeah.
Like there's 100 trillion US dollars. No, sorry, not 100 trillion. 5 trillion. Was it 5 trillion US dollars linked up within the economies of just China and the US. And the globe, I think there's about 100 trillion US dollars. So, you know, that's 5% of the global economy, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's catastrophically massive. And it's going to go far beyond that because it will bring in and impact the world markets of more or less everywhere. It would just be completely unthinkable.
All right.
I don't know.
So, yeah, this is something I also don't understand.
Yeah.
You're a dictator. You rule China, right? You're Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
You're doing all this stuff that is bringing a lot of people out of poverty and doing a lot of things. Why then also, you know, just tack on ethnic cleansing to the end of that? Like, it's evil. Yeah, terrible. It doesn't seem logical.
To his, you say if he was smart enough, he would know that to not do that would better him in the long run.
But also, like, why do it in the first place?
Why do it?
Because I understand why specifically Uyghurs have been targeted, right? Because of.
But there are others.
But they're and it's like, surely you're not just killing people for the sake of killing people, right?
I don't know. I think it's I suppose he actually, right? So I think your point there that you've just made is like if Xi Jinping was a completely realistic guy who only focused on things which would politically make himself better, he probably wouldn't be going after the Uyghurs, okay?
Yeah.
But I think he actually has some genuine romantic, idealistic beliefs in the superiority of the communist, like, ideological doctrine. And in order to promote that, he must come down hard on what he looks on as the religious extremism of Uyghur Muslims in Western China, on the religious nature of the Tibetan people, on the democratic tendencies of the Hong Kongers. I think he does. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's not purely rational, because if he was purely rational, he probably wouldn't be doing it. But his ideological romantic idealism in regard to ideology goes beyond the purely rational. That's why he's doing it.
Okay. Yeah, because I was just thinking, like, no one, like, a serial killer, if they got in power, might just kill people for the sake of killing people, but, like, the likelihood that he would just be like, these guys, you know.
I was just thinking, should I explain what's kind of happening in Xinjiang province to listeners?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah. We probably should have done this earlier, but anyway, so the United Nations, and I am going to get the proper title for this, because I don't want to stuff it up. The United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner did an investigation into allegations being put out about ethnically incited repression within the western province of Xinjiang in China. So Xinjiang, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the XUAR, has 25 million people in it. 45% are ethnically Uyghur, 40% are actually ethnically Han Chinese, which have been brought in from the east, which is, kind of dodgy in itself, really. So you've got Uyghurs, but you've also got Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and Huis, who are all Chinese people, more or less, but some of them feel more Western, which sounds odd, but because when you're in China and you go west, you're actually going more towards the Middle East, which isn't what we usually think about it in that way. Anyway, so what's kind of happened is the Uyghur Muslims have always felt kind of more separate from China, and so there were a number of terrorist attacks over the 1990s and into the early 2000s, and even in 2013, 2014, of Uyghur extremists, a minority, I would say, within the overall Uyghur population, doing some pretty horrible things. I mean, there was in Beijing a bunch of Uyghur terrorists who were on a train and ended up going on like a stabbing spree and killed a number of people there. There was a suicide driver in Beijing as well, I think in 2013, who ran a car into a bunch of people. There have been bomb attacks. There was a bomb attack on a civilian bus back in Xinjiang, Xinjiang province. So a number of kind of horrible things. But more or less what has happened is the Chinese authorities have come into Xinjiang and are now, by, after account after account after account, completely like seemingly authentic matching accounts of Uyghurs who've escaped or have heard things, and also from satellite imagery and simply journalists on the ground poking around. It seems like there is now a modern, ethnically infringing program happening in the province, resulting in these re-education centers, or VETC facilities, vocational education and training centers. So they're kind of these large camps which Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and Huis are arrested. They're brought to, and they then undergo horrific torture, with beatings. They're shackled. They're not allowed to speak their language. They're not allowed to practice their religion. They're given political teachings. There was one guy who claimed that they had to sing communist Chinese songs until their veins were like popping out of their face. This is what really got me. There was a number of women who had never met each other, and the UN was sitting down and chatting to them, and all of them kind of consecutively talked about being given injections and pills like almost daily, and no one really knows what those injections or pills were for. They were also having blood samples taken. I don't understand why blood samples were being taken. There's sexual violence. There are apparently rooms specifically made without cameras, which these women are taken to and then raped. I mean, that's horrendous. And then, there's forced sterilization, there's forced IUDs, and it seems to be specifically aimed to control and to just completely almost destroy and wipe out the Uyghur population.
God. Feeling really bad about the podcast from a few weeks ago after.
Yeah, it's horrendous. And I mean, what gets really weird is it's like the Chinese have officially claimed in government documents that there have been no terrorist attacks since 2016. And say, okay, there's no terrorist attacks in 2016. Why on Google Earth has the number and the construction of these detention centers been increasing massively? So I've gone this specific. So there's this, and I'm probably not pronouncing this right, but there's this Urumqi number 3 detention center in Dabansheng. And simply just through Google Earth, in 2018, there were 40 buildings on this site. 2019, there were 68 buildings on this site. And in 2022, there were 92 buildings in this site with barbed wire, watchtowers, prison houses. That's what this looks like. And it's like, well, okay, if you're claiming that there's been no terrorist attacks since 2016, and the only reason you're coming after these people is because of terrorist claims, why are these detention camps increasing so much? That's just how do you explain it? Like, what are the? Can't. There's no other way around.
That's why I asked you before. It's like this, like, it seems like pure evil. So it's just not.
It's horrendous, and even people who aren't taken into this VETC centers, like there's been reports of Chinese police patrolling and checkpointing major roads within Xinjiang province, simply not allowing Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities to move around the province and to let alone even leave the province into China, let alone actually leave China. Apparently there have been several instances of Uyghur Muslims coming back into China, and they show their passport, and because it has the Uyghur ethnicity on their passport, then they're taken away for questioning, and the second they get back into China, they disappear.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrible, and shrouded in mystery, and so I don't know. It's horrible to say, but it's like, well, I mean, you and I have been calling for the US and China to be in managed strategic competition to avoid a war. But it's like, well, if we're calling for managed strategic competition to avoid a war, then we're allowing the Chinese government to keep doing this stuff. But then it's like, well, it's a horrible choice, but it's like, if we allow the Chinese state to be stable, even if it means doing this stuff, it means we avoid bringing the whole world into a global war, which would, simply through utilitarian thinking, would be worse. Which is horrible to say, but it probably would be.
Yeah.
It's pretty horrendous.
And yes, and but for the skeptical people listening, because definitely based on things that we've said in the past, Will and I are both don't take things at face value. I have an idea of what might be running through your head, because it ran through my head immediately after hearing about this, and I looked into it. During the Afghanistan war, around 2002, there was a bunch of military war camps set up around the world. They're called blacklist sites, I think, something like that, by the United States. And what they're allegedly for was putting terrorists in them. But what ended up happening was people would take bounties to get rid of, military officers and stuff would take bounties to get rid of people. So people that ended up in those camps were about 40% innocent of terrorism or anything like that. So you can look at this and it's like, this looks on the surface level like quite a similar sort of thing. You've got an initiative to stop terrorism, where a bunch of people are thrown into these camps, and there was human rights violations in these camps of torture and rape and all sorts of terrible things. And not to dismiss this or anything, but in Guantanamo Bay specifically, which is sort of the main one that we know the most about on what happenings happened there was roughly 800 people imprisoned. In these camps for these Uyghurs, it's about 1.3 million.
I've seen 500,000 to above 1 million.
It is important to note Guantanamo Bay was one of 20 of these blacklist sites, and we don't really know any information about the other ones, but it seems very unlikely it's going to be a higher number than that. Guantanamo. Yeah.
And the thing is, I mean, I honestly think you can't compare them, because it is like the whole Chinese bureaucratic state going after ethnic minorities. I mean, the ethnic minority is the difference. The targeting of an ethnic minority. Guantanamo Bay isn't for a targeted, repressed ethnic minority.
Well, it is not purposefully. So it was people taken off the streets of Afghanistan. Obviously, they're going to be members of the same ethnicity. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. But you look at Xinjiang, and you look at the passport controls and the border checkpoints and the police raids, and I mean, it's a systemic thing within a specific So I mean, people who pull the Guantanamo Bay card, it's like, this is what we were saying. The US gets up to dodgy stuff. I'm not excusing that, not at all. And we need to be wary of that. And people who are, crazily patriotic about America and just the West in general, they need to check that. But what China seems to be doing, to the best of our idea, is just catastrophically worse. Yeah.
I'd like to clear up.
I don't know.
Actually, I said about 40% were innocent. It was actually 40% weren't convicted of any crimes. So I don't know what the difference is there, but it seems like it might be important. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
Here's a theoretical for you, Will. China enters Taiwan. Who gets involved?
Well, I've done a bit of thinking about this. So the current kind of ideas in regards to China properly going into Taiwan. Also, actually, before we get into the fun kind of theoretical wargaming, I just want to clarify: have we, like you and I, more or less come to the same conclusion?
Yeah, because of course we have. Because
okay.
That's what seems to happen when you do a little.
Actually, no. This is actually this is what I wanted to ask you, because I know this might annoy you.
Okay.
Right? So, because we need to have some kind of argument. Should the U.S. pull their troops stationed around China out of China? Should the U.S. stop? Because I know currently the U.S. has the So the U.S. 7th Fleet used to patrol 6 miles off the Chinese coast. And I have some statistics here. So currently the US has 73 military bases in South Korea. They have 26,000 troops there. Currently, the US has 120 bases in Japan. They have 53,000 troops there. They've got troops in Guam. They've got troops in the Philippines. They've got troops in the Wake Islands. I mean, they have 7 bases in Australia. Specifically around East China Sea and the Southeast China Sea, the US have a massive military presence. Should they pull out to foster better relations between China and US?
It's hard. I'm not a military strategic expert by any means. Purely looking at it again from like a blank slate, just America and China, they're just countries, right? It seems extremely unfair for the US to be based all over the world. And you would, if you put yourself in China's shoes, it makes sense for you to be upset with that and retaliate.
Yeah.
That. I don't know if they should pull out. I don't think it was wise for them to go in at the time they've gone in. I would suggest.
Can I explain why they did go in?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of odd because it's like, it all comes out of the Second World War. So the Americans put troops into Japan after the Second World War to help build up the new Japanese state.
Yeah.
The Americans had troops in South Korea to defend them from North Korea. The US troops have troops in Guam because, again, it was the Japanese connection there after the Second World War. And they've just kind of kept that post-World War II influence in that region, I guess. So that's, just to give you an idea, that's why they are there in the first place. In 1945 didn't come around and they were like, Communist China's going to completely overpower us. Quickly, get all the troops into Southeast Asia. That's not really what they were thinking.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a hard now, right? Because we're kind of in this weird middle thing where it's like, is China going to invade Taiwan? Are they not? I mean, it seems like they are, but it didn't seem like Russia was actually going to go into Ukraine. You know what I mean? And it would seem appropriate for there not really to be now, but when things inevitably do start ramping up, then you move that chess piece. You know what I mean? But what you're saying is they set this up ages ago, and it would be this kind of awkward thing of like pulling out then going back in, which would just antagonize them far, far more. If you're
it probably would. Yeah.
So it's hard to say, but if it matters what happens in the future, so it's kind of impossible to tell. But I would say that now you're there, just stay.
just stay.
Yeah.
And I mean, even like
build more, I'd suggest, would be my thing.
Oh dear. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the hypotheticals of China going into Taiwan. So full discrepancy, I watched a video from The Telegraph, which is a newspaper. I don't think they're owned by Murdoch, but I still think they're kind of center right in their views. It's a British newspaper. They had quite a good YouTube video on what the current theories are behind China going into Taiwan. So China's pretty much of the opinion that it will take 48 hours for a global response to be prepared and for financial and economic sanctions to be administered to kind of constrain China. 48 hours. So the idea is that they have 48 hours to get into Taiwan, to destroy the Taiwanese army, set everything up, and bang, the world's too shocked. It's already happened. They can't really do anything. It's too awkward. The point has already passed. So the idea. So one theory is that it's pretty much, you know, partly based off what they're doing now. They have naval patrols close to the Taiwanese coastline. They have aircraft patrols into Taiwanese airspace. Let's say, you know, 2035. One of these air patrols is just a little bit larger than the last one, and it just goes on a little bit longer. And then suddenly you've got rockets and bombs raining down on Taiwanese military targets. So there's this initial strike from an air force, and then before those bombs have probably even started coming down onto Taiwan, massive, and it would have to be like an armada of unprecedented scale has started to come from China, aiming at Taiwan, with troop carriers, with frigates, with aircraft carriers, with destroyers, with battleships, I mean, with submarines, the whole thing. Because there is 70 miles of water. Like, back in the day of the Second World War, everyone was like, the Nazis are gonna, you know, they're gonna invade Britain across the Channel. The Channel is a lot smaller than the strait between China and Taiwan. It's really a lot smaller. So the logistical feat of getting this massive army to land an amphibious landing on Taiwan is actually just really, really difficult. I mean, you look at the difficulties the Russians have been having with Ukraine, and they had a massive land border with road links, with rail links, with airports, and I mean, and they've been having difficulty as well. So an amphibious landing would actually be really quite difficult. And it's like, okay, so Chinese Air Force has knocked out a large majority of Taiwanese targets. Even Chinese rockets from the mainland has knocked out a majority of Taiwanese targets. And then you land troops on the beaches. That's theorizing that you get through the Taiwanese Navy, which is in itself is like a decently, you know, it'll be able to put up a fight and inflict some damage. So you land troops on the beaches, and it's like, okay, well, now you've got all these troops on the beaches. Now you have to get up the beaches. And the other thing is Taiwan is a mountainous, hilly country. Like, geographically, it's quite difficult, or it would be quite difficult to invade. So, I mean, the current thinking now is China doesn't actually have the militaristic technology and potential to successfully launch an amphibious landing on Taiwan. They think it's too dangerous to do. So that's the first scenario, and too dangerous to do. So the Chinese, at the moment, aren't really thinking about that. The second idea, which I think is probably far more likely, maybe, is like just a massive cyber attack against Taiwan. I think China is currently, what is it? So the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which I will clarify, some look on as a kind of hawkish neoconservative think tank, but regardless, they have claimed that China leads the world in 37 of 44 of the current world's critical technologies, including drones, machine learning, electric batteries, nuclear energy, critical mineral extraction. Anyway, the idea is if China launches a fundamentally serious cyber attack on Taiwan, and all of Taiwan's technological and communication kind of infrastructure goes down, they then launched an invasion. That would be far more successful because the Taiwanese wouldn't be able to respond. So there's an idea there. There's also an idea, which I think might even be more possible, is like just simply a kind of, well, then the other side of this is that it might actually give the world time to respond, because so the idea here is that the Chinese Navy, which is currently the largest navy in the world by surface and underwater vessel numbers, the idea is that they simply blockade Taiwan from the rest of the world in a naval blockade, and don't let anything in, don't let anything out, and just kind of squeeze the Taiwanese until eventually they falter, come into negotiations, and China can start hammering away at them without actually having any serious conflict. The thing with that is it would take time and give time for the US and the rest of the Western world to respond. So from what I've just put forward, the invasion itself is like massively ambiguous. And the ideas behind how it would happen and how it would operate are just, there's so many different ideas of how it could happen. I know Kevin Rudd was saying in an interview, which you might have seen, he was asked about the US military kind of wargaming out scenarios with the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And from Kevin Rudd's unofficial sources within the US military, it seems that, like, more often than not, hypothetical war games of China going to Taiwan usually result actually in China's favor, but not enough for China to be secure enough to do it. So Xi Jinping is smart. I think he will wait until the US has dipped, until China's kept on rising, and until he has almost 100%, guaranteed success of going into Taiwan. I don't know. It's interesting.
The thing that worries me is, like, and this is almost purely selfish, is just how reactionary the people in charge of both China and the US would be. And I do worry, and it sounds kind of dumb for, like, me to say as the guy in my bedroom, but it's like, I hope everyone thinks what they're going to do through very thoroughly before they do it. Because,
I'm sure they will.
Well, you said what, 48 hours for us to react?
Okay, no, I see what you mean. Yeah.
I don't know. And I know I don't mean to be so alarmist, but, like, what happens, like, what do you think the likelihood of the button being pressed is? Like,
no, I think that's pretty low.
Why?
Because I think, regardless of how reactionary the leader of the US and the China are, I think they would realize that unless there was a mistake, I think they would realize that nuclear war would be far beyond anything any of them would really want to do.
Okay.
It would, like, the cost of initiating a nuclear war for either side would fundamentally outweigh the benefits. Yeah. And you look at the Chinese build-up currently. I don't know the statistics, but I think they are more aiming towards the build-up of conventional weapons and warfare rather than nuclear weapons.
Right, but even without nuclear weapons, as we were saying before, I was going to say this is going to be, but hopefully it doesn't happen. This would be just pure technology, even in these conventional weapons, a far more destructive war than it would otherwise be. And if this were to happen, it may not be the end of the world, but it would more than likely be the end of the world as we know it. And it's really terrifying. It messes with my head how close we are to that. Like, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen in our lifetime.
Yeah, I guess so. Which makes you think, are we being too alarmist? But with all of the information, with what the experts are saying, I don't know.
And it's like, we're not just, like, you know, I don't mean to pipe us up, but we did research into this. Like, we spent time. And, like, it's not like we've just watched the news and been like, oh my god, China is terrible. They're going to attack us.
Yeah,
But,
no.
Yeah. So what can we do?
It's an interesting one. What can... Oh, God. I don't know. We can make stupid little podcasts and
oh, you bet.
pretend we know stuff.
As soon as they step in, we'll be...
we'll be there. We'll be live recording.
I'm in Taiwan right now.
Yeah. Fence sitters Taiwan special. Nah. I don't know.
Should we look into, you know, what organizations can keep civilians safe, or I don't know. I'm just trying to think of ground level.
Maybe. Another thing I wanted to point out is just like, okay, we're in Southeast Asia. China goes into Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Guam, maybe Thailand. They all kind of get involved. Sure, Australia gets involved. New Zealand gets involved. The US comes in, obviously, Canada, but Europe is very interesting at the moment. And there's actually been some kind of division within the Western world as to Europe's policy on China, and also within Europe itself, within the Franco-German relationship. So you probably weren't aware, but Macron, the president of France, and Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Council, which is like an overarching European Union body, they both visited China quite recently. And Macron was, I mean, let's just say a lot of people in the West and a lot of Americans were very angry with how friendly and open he was being to Macron. Sorry, to Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
A lot of Americans were actually quite angry with Macron. And it in regards to the simple question of which way will Europe sway, will the European Union sway in regards to a conflict over Taiwan, it isn't certain that they will now support America, which is a massive question in itself about what's happening there. It's an odd one. It is an odd one.
I don't want to be the voice of, you know, terror, like
of worry and
all that, because I think like I think everyone needs to consider, like, if you're at all interested in politics, look into this, and keep these things in mind, because the only thing we can do is exercise our democratic power when voting, I guess. And all we can hope for is that, you know, the better of two terrible things happen. And I don't really know what that is, but...
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I suppose, I don't know, just maybe in a kind of conclusionary remark, for listeners who've gotten this far and are completely as muddled as us, I guess the point of this podcast was just to clarify, to think, and to really get to the bottom of the problems with some decent sources to get us there. Because at the moment, there's a lot of, frankly, dodgy information out there, you know, either anti-US or anti-China, or, you know, with specific underlying kind of currents involved, which aren't perhaps as accurate as they should be. So that's kind of what the point of this chat was, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just, examining your own biases and I don't know.
I mean, I think the crisis point will come, I don't know, like late 2030s, early 2040s, and we'll just have to see what point the world is in at that point. And we'll just have to see what happens. I don't know. I do not know. But anyway.
All right, folks. I hope you enjoyed 50% facts and figures and 50% us sitting in our own despair. If you enjoyed what you heard today, remember to subscribe and leave a like. And
all those good things.
You know, thanks to all people that thanks to Jeffrey for coming on last week. That was
Yeah.
good fun. A bit more of an uplifting one if you need something after this. I think was it?
Yeah, it was kind of uplifting.
Or go on to
we got them.
the Q&A was pretty uplifting. Go on to that one.
Yeah, go on to that one.
Next week we'll do something a bit lighter for everyone.
Yes. We'll look at the crisis in Sudan. Yippee!
Oh yeah, right.
We will be back next week. We'll be back into the swing of things. Probably another 7 or 8 episodes, and then maybe a break again. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. For, seriously, it's if you made it this far, that's very cool.
Yes.
Through all our
Thank you very
rambling.
much.
And actually, love to hear what people think. Leave some comments. Send us some DMs. Send us some emails. If you send one, we might even read it out at the end of the show tomorrow. So you have to listen to the whole thing. Yeah. Next week. Okay.
Yes.
Love you all.
Alrighty.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.